Continuing along, 12C is on pain and temperature. For temperature, the types of receptors are called thermoreceptors. Thermo is in thermal. So those are our receptors for temperature. They have what are called free nerve endings. So unlike the mechanoreceptors that we saw in the skin that had specific structures to them, they were corpuscles or they were discs. These are just little branches of the ends of the axons or the beginning of the axon, right? Sensory cell neurons are weird. So they're just called these little free nerve endings, and they have special temperature sensitive receptors. Now, how do you sense temperature? Interestingly, they have these protein channels, and proteins will change shape in response to temperature. Sometimes irreversibly so, like when you cook your egg and the proteins in the egg denature and become very different in structure, and sometimes reversibly. So these are obviously going to be reversible changes in shape that then change the ion channels and allow for depolarization and sending of an action potential. Now, what's interesting about these receptors is that they can also be triggered by certain molecules. So cold receptors, for example, can also be triggered by menthol. And hot receptors can be stimulated by capsaicin, which is the ingredient, the molecule that gives hot peppers their heat, as well as the molecule that's in wasabi. And I didn't write down the name of that. So wasabi is that green stuff that comes with your sushi. Japanese, really spicy, comes from a root. Anyway, so temperature is going to use the same nerve fiber types and neural pathways as pain. So I'm not going to talk about them now because we're going to talk about them when we talk about pain, and then just know it follows the same pathways. So let's talk about pain. Pain is otherwise known as nociception, and so our pain receptors are nociceptors. Just like thermoreceptors, they are free nerve endings, and they have a variety of noxious stimuli that they can sense. So pain is actually a useful signal to us that there is something happening that might be damaging or harmful to a part of our body. So pain is actually a really important sense to have, assuming it is operating correctly. So if something is very acidic, has a low pH, we have receptors that will respond to that. We have some receptors that are mechanoreceptors that will respond to crushing or shearing or cutting of tissues. We also have receptors that will respond only to very, very cold or very, very hot temperatures, right? So dangerously cold and dangerously hot. So what's interesting about nociceptors and thermoreceptors, actually, I didn't include that, sorry, is that they're not just found in skin. So we're going to find these in the muscles, in the bones, and in some of the organs. But interestingly, you will not find any nociceptors, you will not find any pain receptors in the central nervous system itself, which is kind of fascinating. And it's also why a lot of brain surgeries are performed with the patient awake. So once you have removed the portion of the skull that you need to, you're doing stuff in their brain, they don't feel it, and it certainly doesn't hurt. And interestingly, sometimes it's really important to have the patient awake and following commands or giving you feedback, telling you what they are perceiving, like, oh, you just touched something and now I feel a tingling in my left hand, for example, can be really important information for the surgeons. So this picture is of a musician who played violin during their surgery because they needed to see how it would impact things and make sure not to disrupt anything. Actually, one of the violinists in the Minnesota Symphony, yeah, is it Minnesota, not Minneapolis? Yeah, Minnesota had brain surgery while playing their violin because they had a tremor and they were doing a surgery to try to get rid of it. Fascinating. So if you want to Google awake during brain surgery, you will find no end of videos and images of people getting brain surgery while awake because there are no nociceptors. So much of our information about the somatosensory system, so the homunculus, how the different things map onto the parietal cortex or the somatosensory area, comes from neurosurgeons touching different parts of the brain while the patient awake and saying, what do you feel now? What do you feel now? What do you feel? That is actually how we mapped out a lot of the brain. Fascinating. Okay, back to nociception, not in the central nervous system. So the axons that we're going to find used by nociceptors are one of two types. They are A delta or C fibers. These are smaller. Do I have an animation here? I don't remember. Yes, I do. Okay. These are smaller and therefore slower than the ones for touch, right? Now, interesting, the A delta give us that kind of sharp, localized sensation, and the C fibers give us that more dull, throbbing, aching type of pain. So you can thank your A delta fibers or your C fibers, depending on which type of pain you are having. Now, this difference in speed is also high when you first injure yourself. So let's say you poke yourself with something, or even better yet, you accidentally cut yourself with a knife or you get a paper cut. If you pay attention, the first thing you feel is the touch. The first thing you feel is something just went through my skin. And then the next thing you feel is the sharp pain. And then the next thing you feel is a dull throb. So we actually consciously experience this difference in speed of transmission due to difference in diameter of the axons and difference in degree of myelination of the axons, which is fascinating. Okay, so now we're in an A delta or a C type axon or nerve fiber. Where do we go? So our first order sensory neuron, like always pretty much, is going to be in our dorsal root ganglion. So that's going to look very familiar. And so then from there, the axon is going to travel into the spinal cord. Now here's where we see a difference compared to touch. Our second order neuron is going to be right here in the dorsal horn. So right away, we don't have to go all the way up to the medulla like we did for the DCML for touch. No, it's right there waiting for you. So that's our second order neuron. And then its axon decussates, goes to the other side. And then once it gets to the other side, it's going to travel up through the lateral column in something called the spinothalamic tract. So that second order neuron's axon decussates, it crosses to the other side, and then it goes up in the lateral column in a structure called the spinothalamic tract. From here, so this is, again, we're showing a region of the lumbar spinal cord, cervical spinal cord. I'm going to change to green, maybe that'll show it better. And we're traveling up through the lateral column here, and then we get to the medulla, and we just keep going because we already had our second order neuron. So that's where the other guys were synapsing, but like we already did. So then we go up again through the spinothalamic tract all the way to the thalamus, where we're going to find our third order neuron. So your third order neuron is always in the thalamus, and then it's going to send its signals out to the somatosensory cortex. This is another way of looking at that same thing. So again, our first order neuron is our, I'm going to go back to blue. Our first order neuron is our sensory neuron. I've got my free nerve endings over here that are detecting pain or temperature, because remember I said they use the same pathway. And then that axon is traveling. It's coming in through a spinal nerve, in through the dorsal root to the dorsal horn, where I synapse with my second order neuron. Then my axon is going to decussate, cross to the other side, and ascend, go up through the spinal cord in the lateral column in the lateral spinothalamic tract. It's going to go all the way up then to the thalamus, which is where I find my third order neuron, which is then going to send the signals out to the somatosensory cortex. So if we compare and contrast the DCML system, the dorsal column medial lemniscus system, which is for touch, and the cutaneous mechanoreceptors that we learned about, versus this lateral spinothalamic tract, which is what the system through which pain and temperature signals travel, we can see that for DCML, where am I? Here I am. For DCML, you come in and you don't synapse until you get all the way up to the medulla. And then you synapse with your second order, you decussate, cross to the other side, and then you ascend and go up to the thalamus and your third order neuron. For the spinal thalamic tract, you come in and you synapse right away in that dorsal horn, decussate right away, and then ascend through the lateral spinal thalamic tract all the way up to the thalamus. And then from the thalamus, you're going to send signals out to the somatosensory cortex. Similar, but different. So in summary, for pain and temperature, thermoreceptors change in response to temperature and can also be triggered by certain molecules. Nociceptors are our pain receptors, which are also free nerve endings, and they can respond to a variety of noxious stimuli, but we don't have any in the central nervous system. They may have A delta axons, which carry sharp pain, or C fibers or C axons. We use fibers and axons interchangeably, I'm sorry, which carry that dull aching pain, both of which are slower than the A beta fibers that we have for touch. So you feel the touch first, and then the pain, and then the throb. And so the pathway then as we come in is called the lateral spinal thalamic tract. So we've got our first order neuron cell body in the dorsal root ganglion, as always, and then we're going to synapse right away with our second order neuron in the dorsal horn, which is its axon is going to decussate right away in the spinal cord. We go up through the lateral spinal thalamic tract until we reach our third order neuron in the thalamus, which then sends the signals out to the parietal cortex. So that's it for pain and temperature initial information. The next part is a few interesting things about pain. See you there.